and WEVQ Littleton 91.9.
And online at NHPR.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Peter Biello, and it's time to do the Roundup. Governor Chris Sununu vetoes the death penalty repeal bill. A bill that aims to eliminate gerrymandering in New Hampshire gains bipartisan support, and lawmakers debate whether to require middle and high schools to provide free pads and tampons to students. These and other stories made headlines this week, and we're going to talk about them in this hour. Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. That's 1-800-892-NHPR. You can also send us an email. The address is exchange@nhpr.org, or post on our Facebook page, NHPR Exchange. It's all one word. Search for that. We're also broadcasting a live video of this radio show today. You can watch at our Facebook page. Again, search for NHPR Exchange. And here to talk about the week's news and answer your questions are Howard Altschiller, executive editor of the Seacoast Media Group, which includes the Portsmouth Herald and Foster's Daily Democrat, Matt Sartwell, managing editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you.
Hey, Peter.
Again, listeners, the phone number for you to call to join the conversation, 1-800-892-6477. We've got some news this morning to share with you. But first, before we dive into the conversation, I just want to start off by way of disclosure. Howard Altschiller, married to Democratic Representative Deborah Altschiller. Just want to bring that up.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, Howard, for being here. Really appreciate it. So we want to start the show by talking about the death penalty repeal. Governor Chris Sununu was surrounded by police officers this morning as he sat down to veto the bill to repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire. The bill passed by veto-proof majorities in the Senate and House earlier this year. Sununu has been clear in his opposition to any repeal of the state's death penalty, and he followed through on his word with a veto just a few minutes ago, as of this broadcast on Friday morning. So, Howard, I want to get your thoughts on this.
Right. So the veto itself is not a surprise. It's what he said he was going to do, and now he's done it. And as you say, it passed both the House and the Senate by veto-proof majorities. I've got to say, I think this was really one of the most moving debates and discussions in the legislature this past session, and it's been just fascinating to watch how the issue has evolved over the years. We've kept a particularly close eye on it because the legislative leader on this has been Rennie Cushing from Hampton, who is in our core territories, and we've watched this from being a no-go, a decade or more ago, to slowly people's opinions are evolving, and it's now become pretty much a bipartisan issue, and I think they're going to override the veto.
Dean?
Yeah, it's as Howard said, it's been fascinating to watch this issue evolve over many years, really, to one that is no longer clearly partisan in terms of who supports it and who opposes it. There's Republican and Democratic support for repeal, and it's likely to be overridden. And a lot of this has been driven over the years by the rise of DNA technology and people on death row turning out to be innocent after they run the DNA. There are also increasing issues with the nature of the drugs used for executions. They're harder to get. There's been some debate over whether or not it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. So the entire political context around the death penalty has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, and so it looks like we're finally going to see it repealed in the state, assuming that the likely override numbers hold later in the year.
Mm-hmm. So Sununu, in vetoing the bill, called it an injustice to law enforcement, victims of violent crimes, and slain police officer Michael Briggs, who was killed by Michael Addison, who's on death row for the murder of Briggs in 2006. He's the state's only death row inmate. Supporters of capital punishment argue the courts will see it differently. Sununu vetoed a similar bill last year. Matt Sartwell, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in Manchester, the police department and the people are really concerned about the killing of Michael Briggs. I mean, there's been a letter writing campaign to the senators voicing their large discontent with the repeal of the death penalty, and I think that's really going to be an issue going forward.
Well, listeners, feel free to give us a call if you have a thought on this, 1-800-892-6477, or email exchange@nhpr.org.
Yeah, and just to be clear, following up on what Matt said, the concern is that that although the repeal would in theory exempt Michael Addison from his death sentence being commuted, there's concern that if you look at what's happened in other courts around the state, people who've been on death row, when there's a repeal going into effect, their death sentences have then been commuted to life in prison without parole. So there's concern, I think, among the law enforcement community that the regardless of what reassurances there are legislatively, that the reality in the courts is that his sentence would be commuted eventually to life in prison without parole. And then the final issue we haven't talked about yet is cost. We don't have a death chamber here in New Hampshire. No one has been executed, I think, for 70 or 80 years. So that would be from scratch, cost millions of dollars. So there's just a whole host of issues that have changed the issue. But there is this concern, as Matt said, that justice would not be served, and certainly the law enforcement community feels very strongly about that.
And so, so for 100 years, no one's been, no one's been executed by the state. So the critics say, why are we rushing to change this now?
Howard?
Yeah, I guess the other thing I just wanted to comment on is that one of the things that was impressive about this debate is, it's a very divisive time, and the rhetoric is very heated, and this was a very respectful debate. You felt like the people who were looking to repeal really understood what a difficult and painful issue this is, and for those who believe that we should continue to have capital punishment for the most heinous crimes, I think they understand where the other side is coming from as well. So it was a good substantive debate, and I think New Hampshire can be proud of how it handled this.
Well, let's put the death penalty conversation aside for now as we wait to see what the legislature will do with Governor Sununu's veto. Let's talk a little bit about some legislation in the State House this week having to do with guns. There are bills in the House. They passed the House near party lines. One of them would impose background checks for private gun sales. Howard, advocates are saying this would prevent people who shouldn't have guns from getting them. What are opponents saying?
Well, my sense of the opposition is just that they don't feel that these bills are well crafted, that they won't do what they say that they're going to do, and there's also a feeling of holding the line, that they don't want to support these bills because they feel like this would just be the first of many bills rolling back what they see as their right under the Second Amendment.
So the other two would be, one would impose background checks. One would require a 7-day waiting period, right? Which supporters say would reduce the number of suicides in New Hampshire by giving people sort of a cooling off period. And then the third would be ban guns in school zones. Right. Matt, you've been nodding your head along to Howard's comments about these bills. Is that your sentiment as well?
Yeah, and I feel like this is while there has been some good compromise in the legislature this year, this is not one you're going to see a lot of compromise on, right? I mean, you're probably going to see a 10-14 vote in the Senate on all these issues, and then a likely Sununu veto coming down the pike that can't be overrode. Mm-hmm. So,
Dean?
So as the other panelists were saying, this is one of the most, if not the most divisive partisan issue out there. It's a clear litmus test at this point between Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans view it as an infringement on Second Amendment rights, and Democrats see this as an issue of personal safety. Take for instance the bill on the gun-free school zones, a bill that would limit carrying on school property to law enforcement, military, and people authorized by the school board. There's a big debate in the country about whether or not people carrying guns into schools makes the schools more or less safe should there be some sort of a mass shooting incident. I have no expectation that Governor Sununu would sign any of these bills. It's just been Republicans' standard strategy not to give ground in any respect for fear that this would lead to kind of a tipping point on First Amendment, Second Amendment rights. I should mention on the background checks, I think there's an exemption for friends and family, people who you know well, which is another issue that is always of concern. But this is one of those things that is core course, supported it. Kind of, during the Obama administration, the focus on gun control had kind of, backed away a little bit. And then we had the Sandy Hook shootings. And even then, President Obama wasn't able to get anything through Congress. And now Democrats have made it a little more central part of their agenda. Certainly, the Parkland shootings have had an added impact on that down in Florida. So they're following through on this. But I think the governor's going to veto all of them. And I don't know that they can be overridden.
Is there any one of these that is sort of more or less passionate in their support or opposition than the others?
Well, the background checks and the waiting period, these are perennial debates. The gun-free school zone, particularly in the wake of the Parkland shooting, when a number of those students have become more active and have kind of worked around the country on the issue, that's had a little more visibility lately. And it is, and I've said this many times before on the show, it comes down to whether or not, if you're sitting at your child's school concert, do you feel more or less safe knowing that some other parents are carrying concealed weapons on school grounds? Some people think that makes the environment safer. Some people think it makes it more dangerous.
And just to tag on to that, and even in the Parkland debate, some of the activist students there are advocating for teachers or school personnel to be armed. Also, I think one of in the testimony, I thought it was very interesting that the New Hampshire Medical Society was quoting that as far as the cooling off period goes, that there was 130 suicides caused by firearms in the state last year. I think that's a really interesting statistic.
And another statistic they mentioned is that states that do have the 7-day waiting period, they see a drop in the number of suicides.
Right.
So opponents disagreed with that statistic, but there it is.
Right.
All right.
I think it's fair to say that this will be litigated in the next election.
Really? Litigated in the next election? Okay. Listeners, this is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup. In just a moment, we're going to talk about the so-called period poverty bill. Lawmakers are considering whether to mandate that middle and high schools purchase and make available to students pads and tampons so girls don't feel like they need to miss school when they're menstruating for lack of pads and tampons. Some lawmakers who are opposed to this say it's an unfunded mandate in our schools. Supporters say it's long overdue. We want to know what you think. Give us a call. The number is 1-800-892-6477 or send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org. Right now, a bill is moving through the legislature aiming to appoint an independent commission or committee to take over the process of drawing up districts in New Hampshire. So, Matt, I wanted to ask you, what's prompting this right now?
Well, in Colorado and Michigan and Ohio and Utah, they've had voter referendums, which we don't do here in New Hampshire, asking for a better system to create congressional districts. As you saw in North Carolina and even in New Jersey, whatever party is in power, they get to make the rules who gets where, and people get lawmakers get drawn out of their districts. They manage to gerrymander so that they have control of the legislature, and it's very hard for the minority party to crack it once they lose it. I think this is a great example of the lawmakers coming together and finding some compromise, really. I mean, it was nice to see that they were able to have a debate and put together a deal that allowed them to come up with a nonpartisan way to draw up these districts.
Right. And I think what people are recognizing is that for democracy to work, every voice has to be represented. And in gerrymandered districts, if they're set up so that one party is always going to win, well, then that party has to be responsive to its primary voters. And once that representative, particularly that congressperson, wins their seat, that's really, that's what their motivation is going to be, is keeping that very small group of voters happy. The way that people talk about gerrymandering is, voters are supposed to choose their politicians. In a gerrymandered system, the politicians are choosing their voters in order to put them back in office. And we had a visit from Hedrick Smith. He's doing something. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, Emmy winner, and he's just done something called the People versus the Politicians. And what he pointed out is that in Congress right now, there are, out of 435 seats, only 40 of them are considered competitive. So that's how little competition. And he says, if you want to keep politicians responsive to the people, you've got to keep them uncomfortable. They need to work for every vote, not just for the votes of their gerrymandered small group.
Yeah, the courts have already dealt with gerrymandering based on race, but the issue of gerrymandering based on partisanship is really starting to make its way into the federal court system. And the argument that Democrats make is that in some states they may get 55% of the vote in an election and only get 20 or 30% of the seats in the House of Representatives. So clearly something is out of whack in their view. This has been a perennial issue for both parties. I think in roughly 2/3 of the states, the state legislature still draws the lines. It's the old to the victor belongs the spoils method. And I know that one of the big criticisms of President Obama during his 8 years were the Democrats lost hundreds and hundreds of seats in the state legislature, which in turn affects the ability to redistrict when in states where the state legislatures make those decisions. So even before 2016, Democrats were gearing up a national campaign in advance of the 2020 census, trying to claw back as much state legislative representation as they could in order to have the opportunity to do the redistricting. There are these movements in some states towards a commission. Other states want to use a panel of judges. This seems to be progress here in terms of a compromise. You have these 15 members, and each party would get to pick 5 from the other's list, and then those 10 would pick the final 5, and the state legislature, I guess, would still get final say. But this has traditionally been viewed as something that you get when you win control of a state politically, and I think a lot of politicians are loath to give that up.
And one of the reasons people are particularly excited about New Hampshire's apparent progress on this compromise is that in most of the states where it's passed, it's been through a citizen initiative, a referendum. We don't have those. So this would actually be one of the first changes in redistricting done through the legislative process. Mm-hmm. So it could be a template for other states.
And the Exchange is going to be covering this debate on Thursday of next week. So stay tuned for a broader conversation on the Exchange about redistricting and ending gerrymandering, the effort to end gerrymandering, Thursday on the Exchange next week. One other story we should talk about before the break has to do with biometric information. We use our fingerprints to unlock iPads and iPhones. We can find out our genetic roots to some extent through kits like Ancestry or 23andMe. We don't really often think about how our DNA or fingerprints could be used as a commodity, but some legislators want a Consumer Protection Act on our DNA and our identifiable data, our biometric data. Howard, why are lawmakers pursuing this?
Well, it's clearly an emerging issue, and as just something most people can probably think about is let's say you did one of these DNA tests through 23andMe, and then they decided to sell that information to an insurance company who decided to deny you life insurance based on what they found in your genome. People use exercise apps all the time, and that's recording your heartbeat and your sleep patterns and all kinds of other stuff. Well, again, that data, it's good to have for you personally. It might not be so good for somebody else out there. And then if you really start to look at this and where this can go and where this technology is going, it can get really dark really fast. What was interesting about this bill in reading it is it's a fairly brief bill on an incredibly complicated topic. And I think it's in the Senate right now under study. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with it is it's very sweeping. I mean, I've seen Gattaca. I know how bad things can go, right? But it feels like it needs like some sort of specific example that you can actually hang it on. I mean, it seems very wide-reaching to pass a law, and you don't know. That almost seems like a slippery slope in itself. Mm-hmm.
Well, the bill sponsor, Dave Luno, spoke about this on WMUR.
It's right here today. We're dealing with it every day in our everyday lives, and basically everything from security services to how you unlock your iPad, and then of course services that you might subscribe to like Ancestry.com or 23andMe.
And among those who think consumers need to be more careful in what they sign up for around biometric information is Buzz Schur, also speaking on WMUR.
If you gave that data to the third party and effectively were aware what they might do with it, and you still gave them the data, does this statute fix your stupidity?
So I think he meant that as kind of rhetorical there, but does this bill provide some level of protection for people who do something who maybe aren't aware of what they're doing?
Well, the thing is, like, let's look at facial recognition technology, right? You'll occasionally get, dinged by Facebook, and they'll say, "Is this you in this photo?" Well, that's using this facial recognition technology. They're already using it to sort stuff, and it's already in the courts in some states. So we're at the beginning of a monumentally important issue.
Yeah, Matt mentioned Gattaca. I was thinking as we were talking that I'm old enough to have seen the original Blade Runner in the early 1980s, where the only way you could identify a replicant was by doing the retinal scan, the eye recognition, and so that we're there now. And I remember as a teenager thinking, "Wow, that's pretty amazing." But we're there now, and I think this technology, facial recognition, eyes, biometrics, is being increasingly used for all kinds of things we do every day, like checking in for or boarding an airplane. And so the question is, security issues aside, and sort of customs or immigration aside, where that kind of technology is already used, what happens to your information in terms of it being sold to third parties? And I think a lot of people feel like, well, it's just kind of hard to control any of that at this point. And I think this is kind of an attempt to maybe slow down a little bit the dispersion of that information on you into the broader world. But it's increasingly being used. You can now unlock your iPhone just by looking at it, and that's a remarkable thing if you think back what it was like 20 or 30 years ago.
And that's a very good point. But is this a state issue or is this a federal issue? I mean, where does this really need to come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how much control can New Hampshire have on companies that are outside its borders?
Right.
Yeah. Listeners, we're talking about the week's news this morning, and we learned just a short time ago that Governor Sununu has vetoed the death penalty repeal bill that the legislature had passed. We got a comment from Dennis in Barrington who says, "The fact that New Hampshire has not exercised the death penalty in 80 years suggests its continued existence is entirely political. Support for it gives political cover against the charge of being soft on crime. Since it really serves no other purpose, it is time for it to go." That's Dennis from Barrington. Thank you very much for giving your comment to us, Dennis. If you'd like to share your comments about the week's news or questions, send us an email, exchange@nhpr.org, or give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. Still to come, some of those who testified on behalf of former guidance counselor Christy Torbick paid professional consequences. Torbick was convicted of sexually assaulting a student at Exeter High School. Defending Torbick cost some people their jobs, and now those people are suing, saying their rights were violated. What do you think? The number is 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org, or you can post on our Facebook page where there's a live video of this radio broadcast happening right now. I'm Peter Biello. We'll be right back.
This is NHPR. Good morning. Have a car or truck taking up space in your driveway? Well, why not donate it to NHPR and turn those many miles into programs you love? Car donations are tax deductible, and scheduling a pickup is free and easy to do. Get started today at nhpr.org/car donation. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from New England College, now filling summer and fall 2019 classes. Information and applications at nec.edu. And from St. Joseph's Hospital, Nashua, a member of Covenant Health specializing in breast health and experience in partnering with women on their health needs. Learn more at yourbestyounh.org. Cloudy, some drizzle, scattered rain showers today, high temperatures lower 50s. It'll be cloudy with rain tonight, overnight lows in the lower 40s. For tomorrow, mostly cloudy, high temperatures in the mid-60s. This is NHPR.
On Monday on The Exchange, we'll be talking about a new era of astrophysics with last month's release of the first picture of a black hole, plus colonizing the moon with our sky crew in studio. That's coming up on Monday on The Exchange. But right now we're taking a fresh look at the events of the past week on the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup. In the studio with me are Howard Altschiller, executive editor of the Seacoast Media Group, which includes the Portsmouth Herald and Foster's Daily Democrat, Matt Sartwell, managing editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. We'll talk about a variety of stories in the news this week, but we want to take one call first from Dennis in Hopkinton. Dennis, thanks very much for calling.
Hey, folks. I wanted to talk about the whole biometric and sort of personal information data situation. I know that there's a lot of conversation about protecting folks from having their private information be used with malfeasance by corporations, advertisers, and so on. And I have some concerns about that. But my real deep concern is about the misuse of my data by my government, which is far less answerable. I can choose to leave a company and not do business with them. And a company can only do so much to me physically and materially. But my government can do just about anything. And I have real concerns about my government and the data that it has been using, in my opinion, illegally and unconstitutionally for years. And what are they going to do with all of the data that they have on me now?
Dennis, can I ask you what kind of misuse, in your view, you fear the government will perpetrate on your data?
Oh, it's almost, aside from the fact that, and, this is now established, recording every phone conversation, email, etc., because I submitted my genetic stuff through 23andMe, they have my DNA. Governments throughout history that have complete, effectively control over their people. I would ask you, has that typically resulted in safe, happy people, or has that resulted in the worst dystopias mankind has created?
So you think the government, if they have your genetic information, for example, may track down people with a certain genetic trait?
My genetic information, ALPRs, they know where you are when you're driving, your cell phone, every place that you go. This is far too much power for any individual organization to have. And when that organization has the ability to imprison you, to tax you, to control every aspect of your life, how is that not profoundly concerning?
Dennis, thank you very much for the call. Really appreciate it. So does anybody here at this table know if the bill in question in the State House has any kind of provision about how the government can use your data? Matt?
No, it has a carve-out for law enforcement.
So law enforcement can still use the data however it wants. That, I think, might speak to Dennis's fear of it, but no other government stipulation as far as you know.
This sounds reminiscent to me, listening to Dennis, of the debate over Real ID with the driver's licenses with the additional technology built into them that everybody is transitioning to now. And eventually, if you want to fly domestically, you're either going to have the Real ID, I think, at some point in the next year or two, or use your passport.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say that I think he's raising very real and important concerns, and I'm sure people who study civil liberties and are passionate about that are also very concerned.
Dennis, thanks again for the call. Really appreciate it. Listeners, if you have questions about the week's news, give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. So I wanted to talk about the so-called period poverty bill that's in the State House right now. Essentially, this bill would mandate that middle and high school students, or rather middle and high schools in New Hampshire, would have to provide pads and tampons to students for free. The supporters of this bill argue that no young woman should feel like they have to stay home from school while they're menstruating because they don't have pads or tampons to make sure that they can get through the day. Opponents are saying something along the lines of this is an unfunded mandate. Howard, from your perspective, how is this debate proceeding?
Well, what's really great about this is that it originated with a 17-year-old student from Rochester, goes to Spalding High School. She was doing a project for U.S. history, and she learned about period poverty. And what she learned was that young women without resources are either missing a lot of school or using unsanitary substitutes for feminine hygiene products and exposing themselves to illnesses. She submitted a mock bill to, I believe it was an American Legion contest, and then she brought it to Senator Martha Hennessy, who introduced it in the Senate, and lo and behold, it was an issue that resonated, and it's now passed the Senate, it's passed the House Education Committee, and it will go to the full floor of the House. And the argument that supporters make is that we supply toilet paper, and we don't argue about whether or not that's an unfunded mandate, and that's for sanitation and hygiene, and this is for sanitation and hygiene, and it's time to fix it.
The student's name was Caroline Dillon, and we have some audio of her testimony in the Senate.
Periods and period products are such a culturally taboo subject, so it's not like most people would willingly admit that they can't afford it. Girls in middle and high school would never dream of telling somebody that they have to miss school or use socks because they can't pay for pads.
And also as part of the testimony, Jean Ruska, the political director for the ACLU of New Hampshire, she said at this hearing that a student's right to education should include menstrual equity and calls it a bill about human dignity.
I remember when I was in high school, the only place to get a pad or a tampon was from the gym teacher. And her building, the gym, was located about 2 blocks away from the regular school building, which meant your only option was to go out, in the middle of January to go find the gym teacher and hopefully get into her office. That's the type of extreme that too many young female students are forced to endure. It disrupts their educational day. It prevents them from being able to focus on schoolwork. And in a state that so values education that it's in our Constitution, we absolutely support this bill as part of an adequate education.
Jean Ruska speaking about what she thinks is required for an adequate education in this case. Matt Sartwell.
I just think this issue speaks to the need for diversity in the legislature and on school boards, so that all voices are heard from the students. I think that this is probably something that wasn't talked about in the open before, and now that it's getting the attention it rightly deserves, one side or the other, I think that's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. So where do we see the legislature sort of tilting? Do we have any sense?
Well, I don't. I think it's likely to pass the House, but the issue here, I don't think anybody thinks it's a bad idea to provide the materials to the students. I think the question is, who pays for it? I think that's the argument you're hearing. Is that if the state's going to require schools to provide feminine hygiene products, should they pay for it? And if not, what kind of partnerships might there be with nonprofits or other organizations? This mirrors an effort that's taking place globally in a lot of developing countries where the same sorts of issues have arisen for teen girls. And so, I think this is not a question about whether or not it's a good idea. The question is simply, how do you pay for it and who should pay for it?
Interestingly, in Kittery, Maine, this issue was brought up by a student as well, and it didn't go to the legislature, but York Hospital stepped in and decided that they would pay for these products. So there could be room for public-private partnership. And just for people to understand what the cost would be, they have already done this in Rochester at the Spalding High School and Rochester Middle School, and they estimate it's about $2,700 a year.
$2,700 a year. Matt?
Yeah, and from my understanding is that schools already do have these supplies on hand, but they're at the nurse's office instead of being in the bathrooms.
All schools do?
Well, I don't know about that, but that was in the stories that I read. That was my impression.
But so overall, this is at least in part an effort to make sure that students can get these things without having to go, as Jeannie Ruska said, out in the cold and the snow to go ask the one person that they happen to know has it, whether it's the gym teacher or the nurse.
Or having to ask permission in front of others to go to the nurse because you need to get some products.
Right. Something that everybody wants to announce.
Right.
Sorry,
exactly.
I can see it as being very embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Well, we'll certainly keep following this bill as it moves forward. Listeners, give us a call if you have questions or comments about the week's news, 1-800-892-6477. Christy Torbick, former Exeter High School guidance counselor, was convicted of sexually assaulting a student. Several educators and other professionals pleaded for leniency at Torbick's sentencing in Rockingham County Superior Court. Some simply gave character testimony and described the way she conducted herself professionally to their knowledge. And now several of those people who spoke out in support of Torbick are back in the news. And maybe I can go to you for Matt. Matt, what are we hearing from folks who spoke out?
Well, you have to kind of go back to the summer where this is such a big hot topic. I gotta tip my hat to the union leader correspondents Jason Schreiber and Kim Houghton, who really worked this hard for us. What happened with Christy Torbick is that she pled guilty to sexual assault. I mean, she's a 39-year-old, or she was then, and she was an Exeter high school guidance counselor, and the student that she committed the assault against was 14 years old. So during the sentencing hearing, I think it was about 23 people came out. Different people either wrote letters or stood up at the sentencing hearing and gave an account of how they thought Christy Torbick had how do I put this? That she maybe deserved leniency, or they spoke to her record at other schools, including in Bedford and at one of her Nancy Strapko of Plymouth State University.
Mm-hmm. And the purpose of providing testimony on behalf of someone like Christy Torbick is, from the criminal justice perspective, for defense attorneys, a chance to humanize this person, right? To say, look, they are a person, they're not a monster, and judges or juries in general need to take that into consideration when they're figuring out the rightness or wrongness of what needs to happen next, right? Is that how it usually works?
Yeah, that's how it usually works. But I think people were upset that they didn't realize that someone from Bedford High School was going to go there and speak as they perceived it in her defense, or that someone from Plymouth State University, who they see as kind of public officials, were going to speak in her defense.
Mm-hmm. Howard?
Yeah. Well, first, so this was during the sentencing phase. Right. She had pleaded guilty, and so what these people were saying was that please be lenient. Some people said she shouldn't do any jail time, and I think what sparked the outrage was not people saying, I know this person, and in my encounters with this person, they were professional, but some of the comments, and particularly the comment from the professor from Plymouth State.
That was Nancy Strapko.
Right. Mm-hmm. She used the word, she said, I use the word victim in quotes because the 14-year-old was the pursuer. And, that's legally, it's not possible for a 14-year-old to pursue a sexual relationship with an adult. And that a lot of the people who were speaking were guidance counselors, and people didn't understand why their sympathies weren't with the victim of a sexual crime. And I think that's where the outrage came from. What's happening now is what rights do the people who wrote these letters have? And, what may seem right and wrong, on the streets or make common sense is not necessarily what the law says about what you can and cannot say.
Mm-hmm. So let's just to pause and clarify a little bit. So Nancy Strapko, former adjunct lecturer at Plymouth State, she, as revealed by the union leader and through right to know requests, received a settlement from Plymouth State, $350,000, because she was reprimanded by the school for what she said. The other teacher, Zana Blaney, a former dean of students at Bedford High School, is filing a lawsuit now saying she was suspended from her job and eventually fired for this. Zana Blaney didn't go so far as to say the 14-year-old was a pursuer. She didn't say that, as far as I know, correct?
No, she didn't. But I spoke to Jason Schreiber, who was there in court that day, and our reporting shows that it was lengthy and kind of glowing testimony
about her as a person,
about her coworker, her time in Bedford at Bedford High School.
Okay,
and at one point, if you don't mind me jumping in,
I don't mind.
The victim was in the courtroom and actually became so upset, had to leave, and sort of get composed and then come back. So it was very painful,
mm-hmm.
To basically feel dismissed, maybe disrespected at the sentencing hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And the prosecutors were looking for 5 to 10 years on this, and Torbick ended up getting 30 to 5 years.
Why is that significant?
Well, because I think that you could. Some people look at it like, that the defense got a lighter sentence.
Mm-hmm. So is this a First Amendment issue? Are we talking about the rights of people like Zana Blaney and Nancy Strapko to say what they need to say in a court setting without being reprimanded by their jobs, which are associated with the state entities?
Yeah, I think that's the argument that they're going to try to make. There's also apparently a New Hampshire law that prohibits that allows freedom of expression for public employees as well. So I think that's kind of the world in which we're going to be debating here. And Blaney has said that she was speaking as a private citizen. So yeah, I'm sure they're going to make First Amendment arguments.
Okay, listeners, this is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello. We're speaking about the week's news. Still to come, should New Hampshire cities and towns collect an extra $2 per night from hotel rooms and Airbnb rentals? A bill in front of the legislature would allow cities and towns to opt to do just that. But we want to hear from you on this. What do you think? 1-800-892-6477. Email us exchange@nhpr.org. Or post your thoughts on our Facebook page at NHPR Exchange, which is where you can watch a live video of this radio show. We'll be back in just a few.
Washington finally gets around to talking about infrastructure. The president gets into a firefight over firefighters. And post-Mueller, has the White House asked the Attorney General to start asking some questions of his own?
I'm trying to grapple with the word suggest. I mean, they have not asked me to open an investigation.
It's the Friday News Roundup. That's next time on 1A.
That's this morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from demonstrated success providing New Hampshire schools with professional development, climate and culture support and software for school operations, demonstratedsuccess.com. And from the Palace Theatre in Manchester, presenting A Chorus Line, the true-to-life musical about the struggle to achieve greatness on Broadway, now through May 18th. Tickets at palacetheatre.org. This is NHPR.
This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello here in the studio with Howard Altschiller, executive editor of the Seacoast Media Group, which includes the Portsmouth Herald and Foster's Daily Democrat, Matt Sartwell, managing editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. And with you, we hope. Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. If you've got a question or comment about the week's news, you can also send it in by email. The address is exchange@nhpr.org. Also in the legislature this week, lawmakers considering a bill that would allow cities and towns to impose their own $2 per night fee on hotels and Airbnb rentals. The idea is to allow municipalities to share more of the revenue generated by tourism. So, Matt, can I ask you, wasn't this what the rooms and meals tax was originally designed to do?
Yeah, my understanding is it was, but and probably Howard knows this issue inside and out. But the tourist areas like North Conway and Portsmouth, they're not getting the money that they're generating for the state back. Because they're so popular. They're great places to visit, right? But it goes into the general. I think it goes into the general fund. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then it's like doled back to the municipalities, and I think that's based on population. So I think that I think what was it? Something like only about $1 million was coming back to Portsmouth.
Right. So every state senator, every legislator from the Seacoast, from these tourist communities, every session brings forward a bill to try to have more money come back to the communities that are contributing so much more. And just so people have an idea, Portsmouth has 312 businesses that contribute in excess of $27 million a year in meals and rooms taxes, and based on population, gets back just $1.1 million. And in the meantime, they have to provide all the services required to have thousands and thousands of tourists come in and be safe and have an enjoyable experience. And Hampton, it's even worse. They have 402 businesses that pay meals and rooms taxes, but they get back just $780,000. And the cost for the summer police force alone is $600,000. Now, Bedford has slightly more population than Portsmouth, but just 64 businesses contributing meals and rooms taxes, and they get $1.2 million. So they get more than Portsmouth, even though based on the number of businesses contributing, they probably do not have the same tourist activity. The problem is that there's a lot more communities that, there are fewer communities making these major contributions, and so they just have never been able to get a change through the legislature. So the idea of this $2 a night occupancy tax is a way of saying, okay, we know we're never going to be able to change the formula for the meals and rooms tax, but we really, really do need to generate more money because all of this burden is falling on our taxpayers. So, state, will you give us permission to charge $2 a night for either a hotel room or an Airbnb, and then we'll put that in a special fund that will be used to offset some of the costs. And, it's an opt-in. No community has to do it if they don't want to, but towns can't and cities can't just opt to do this. They need the state to give them permission, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah, this has been an interesting issue. I think Howard did a nice job of laying out the concerns about infrastructure, about just how expensive it is to assure a positive tourist experience. And, this has been a debate we've had for a long time now about the extent to which costs have been shifted down to municipal level and the state not fully funding the kinds of infrastructure that's necessary to support tourism on whether it's the Seacoast or up in ski country. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens to this. There's probably going to be some concern about whether adding to the cost of a stay is something will it in some way deter people from coming, or is $2 a night kind of sufficiently small given all the taxes that you often have to pay that people won't really notice it?
We've been talking a lot about this bill with respect to tourism, and I spoke with the assistant mayor of Portsmouth about this earlier this week on All Things Considered, and the focus of that conversation was largely on tourism as well. And I got this note from Representative Susan Almy of Lebanon, who said, quote, "It is incredibly frustrating to have spent the last 5 years getting the Seacoast tourism centers to understand that regular urban centers around the state need this occupancy fee as much as tourism centers, and then to have you only talk of tourism in that interview. The rest, majority of us, provide jobs and most services to our regions, and our residents pay for the infrastructure behind those jobs and services only with the property tax on our residents, which for most of our urban centers is higher than our neighbors. Without a thriving center, hotels will not come or will close. Tourism is only part of the issue and a part of the votes needed to pass this measure." So I wanted to get your thoughts here on.
That speaks to the larger downshifting issue that I was just talking about, where municipalities in general and towns and cities don't feel like beyond the property tax they get sufficient support, and this would be another way of generating money to pay for these kinds of public goods.
Right, and this is another one where the state promised to send back a certain amount of money and then sent less. Originally, they were sending 40%, and now it's down to 28%, and who knows where it'll go the next time we hit another financial crisis.
Mm-hmm. So to Susan Almy's point, is or is not the majority of the burden of the way the rooms and meals tax has played out over the past decade not falling on the major tourism centers?
Well, I'm not sure that I fully understand what she's saying, but maybe what she's saying is that this would be good for everybody, and so let's build a broader political consensus than just the tourism communities. Mm-hmm. I think that's what she was saying.
I'm pretty sure that's what she's saying as well, but we appreciate the comment. Other stories to discuss this week, several of them, in fact, lean heavily on Seacoast-related things, so Howard, I might be turning to you quite a bit. Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Rob Portman, senator from Ohio, reintroduced legislation this week to improve federal efforts to identify the public health effects of emerging contaminants such as PFAS. The Safe Drinking Water Assistance Act would address limits in the Environmental Protection Agency's response to emerging contaminants. PFAS chemicals have emerged as a widespread contaminant in some areas in southern and, of course, eastern New Hampshire on the seacoast. Howard, your thoughts on this effort?
Right. Well, what's going on here is it's not that the chemicals have been there. They've been used since the 1940s. They were phased out once health concerns were being raised. They're basically known for their non-stick properties. What happened was around 2013, 2014, the EPA said that we had to start testing for them. And the minute we started testing for them, they were found everywhere. These chemicals are inorganic, and so they have a really long half-life. Usually the idea of a landfill is that things break down over time, but these take a lot longer, if at all. So my first exposure, and it was a literal exposure, was out at the Air Force Base. The Air Force began testing in 2014 and quickly discovered the Haven well on Pease Air Force Base had a high levels of these PFAS chemicals. And I actually took part in, I had my blood tested because, I'd always heard that, if you want to stay mentally sharp over a long period of time, drink lots of water. And I drank lots of water. And I had my blood tested, and lo and behold, 3 of these key chemicals are twice the national average in my bloodstream. And, we're seeing this now, the Coakley landfill, we're seeing it. We've seen it in my hometown of Stratham. They just discovered it around the fire station because of firefighting foam. Kingston is having an issue. Of course, there was the St. Gobain's plant. But really, this is going to be everywhere. And the question is, first, it's considered a contaminant of emerging concern. So there's nothing definitive. There's a lot of belief that it's going to create health issues, but we need these studies. We need extensive scientific studies to say, here is the connection between exposure to these chemicals and impact on human health. And that's Jean Shaheen has been a real champion for that, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, on what Howard was saying is that they're having even trouble getting consensus on how many parts per trillion these chemicals. Well, I mean, what's the acceptable level? Because they just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Other stories we've reported this week that we should mention. 3 of 4 members of New Hampshire's congressional delegation are calling for Attorney General William Barr to step down. Senator Maggie Hassan, Congresswoman Ann McLean-Custer, and Congressman Chris Pappas all say Barr has to go because of the way he handled Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report. Senator Jean Shaheen, however, says she wants to hear directly from Mueller before deciding whether Barr should resign. Also in the news this week, 2 more women have joined a $70 million class action lawsuit against Dartmouth College, bringing the total number of plaintiffs to 9. The plaintiffs say they were assaulted and harassed by professors in the school's neuroscience department. The school says it took action when it became aware of the misconduct 2 years ago, and a trial is set for 2021. And finally, medical marijuana patients in New Hampshire would be able to grow their own cannabis under a bill approved yesterday by the state Senate. The measure, which passed on a 14-10 vote, allows qualified patients to grow up to 6 plants after registering with the state. Earlier this year, the House passed a different version of the bill. Some members of law enforcement have voiced concern that more marijuana could end up in the wrong hands. And another story relevant to the Seacoast, Howard, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire has a new home in Portsmouth, plans to expand statewide. 2-year-old nonprofit's new offices are in a historic downtown house near Strawberry Bank. What's the history of that building, Howard?
Yeah, well, one of the things Portsmouth is most proud of, and I think rightfully so, is the African Burying Ground. And for your listeners who might not know, in 2003 they were doing some street excavation on Chestnut Street and began encountering bodies. And quick research revealed that this was, an African burying ground going back to the 1700s. And instead of just sort of, kind of moving on, the city really embraced this history, realized that it literally was this rich buried history beneath the ground. I believe it was around 2011, 2012, we began moving forward on this African Burying Ground Memorial, which is on Chestnut Street right now. And this new Black Heritage Trail building is about 2 blocks away, and it will have programming in support of this lesser-known history. I mean, one of the most fascinating things to me in learning about it is 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, slaves in Portsmouth actually drafted their own Declaration of Independence and brought it to the General Assembly and said, just as you are seeking your freedom, help us to be free and eliminate this stain of slavery from society. It's the most amazing document and most amazing story that people don't know anything about. And so this is a part of surfacing that. I know they have a symposium this weekend on slavery and on the emancipation, and it's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. And finally, just really quickly, another story to mention this week. Senator John Morgan, a Democrat from Brentwood, says New Hampshire has a crisis on its hands when it comes to keeping kids safe. He's one of the main sponsors of Senate Bill 6, which increases staffing at DCYF by 77 employees at a cost of $8.5 million. This bill passed the House earlier this week. Matt, can I ask you what started this?
Well, I think this is another issue, like I mentioned before, where the legislature is really going in the right direction. I mean, they're really addressing the DCYF problem. It's just the question of how they're going to do it, right? How many positions, the big debate is how many positions are they going to authorize and how many are they going to fund? And I think the governor's plan is to authorize 62 positions with 26 paid, because we're looking at, how much can the New Hampshire workforce really fill this gap, right? It's a really tough job, and it takes a little bit of expertise, or a lot of expertise, I should say. So I think that's really the crux of the issue going forward.
Yeah, and it's been just simply spurred by crushing caseloads for DCYF caseworkers. Several high-profile tragedies involving children who were kind of in the DCYF universe, and so this, as Matt was saying, this really is a question of there's general agreement that there needs to be more caseworkers, but how do you fill the positions and how quickly do you fund them?
All right. And Howard, go ahead.
Just to put some numbers on it, the national average for caseworkers is 12. Vermont has 16. And New Hampshire right now, the average is 45 cases per worker. So clearly it's a problem, and it looks like everyone agrees that something needs to be done about it.
Well, I wanted to ask you before we have to sign off for the day, what you'll be covering or watching for next week. I'll start with you, Howard.
Well, starting today, there's a big press conference over at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The congressional delegations from both Maine and New Hampshire will be there. They have been expressing concern and lobbying to make sure that funds there's about $200 million in funds for construction at the shipyard, and they want to make sure that's not diverted to build the emergency border wall.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
Well, we're going to have our eyes on the Kentucky Derby.
Is that because Ted Gatzis has a family horse in the race?
Well, his brother Matt Gatzis does. Ted Gatzis, former mayor of Manchester and the current executive counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Vacoma is the horse. Last time I checked, it was a 20-1 long shot, but we'll be keeping an eye on it.
Okay. And Dean, what do you think?
I'm fully immersed in the presidential primary. We're up to, I think, at least 21 candidates at this time. And for people who are interested, it's remarkable how active and accessible in New Hampshire these candidates are. And I think this coming weekend is going to be no exception.
2020 news. I didn't think we'd touch on it this hour.
Got to get in a little bit at the end.
Any thoughts on Game of Thrones or Avengers before we go? I think we need to talk about that maybe a little bit.
Well, I've seen them both, and I got to say, it was really a great weekend for pop culture. I mean, 2 franchises, both 10 years in the making, and just a great spectacle.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by the debate over Game of Thrones about whether or not the battle was filmed too darkly by the cinematographer. This has been a trend in cinematography. Similar complaints for the Walking Dead series, that it was just too dark to see what was going on. And the cinematographer basically said, "Well, too bad. Sorry that we filmed it the way we thought we should be filmed."
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for being here on the program today. Howard Altschiller, executive editor of Seacoast Media Group, Matt Sartwell, managing editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. Thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
That's it for today. But remember, listeners, this conversation continues online on Facebook and at NHPR.org. The Exchange is a production of New Hampshire Public Radio. The engineer is Dan Colgan. Our senior producer is Ellen Grimm. Michael Brindley is our program manager. Our producers are Jessica Hunt and Christina Phillips. Our public radio fellow is Ali Oshinsky. Rebecca Lavoie is working the cameras, and our theme music was composed by Bob Lord. I'm Peter Biello. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great weekend.